Okay, everybody, here we are on our last learning video for OLI Mod 9. Question number 10, we're being asked to create some box plots for the sugars and the carbohydrate columns, and then we're going to take a look at the spread and comparing typical data values. So I wanted to go over here in StatCrunch. I still have my potassium box plot, so rather than starting off with the graph function again, I can just go into the options menu here. Let me bring that down so you can see it. I did want to show you for just a second why I would not want to compare potassium along with these two new categories of carbohydrates and sugars. If I include all three of them, well, we can see that because the range for potassium is so much larger than that of the carbohydrates and the sugars, we just can't even see what's going on in these two other box plots. So we can really only compare if we've got a similar range, if we have a similar distribution. So for right now, we're just going to compare the carbohydrates and the sugars. We've got our fences to identify outliers using drawing our boxes horizontally. Click compute, and there we go. So I'd like everybody to take a few moments to look at each of the distributions shown to us in the box plot. Certainly neither one of them has any outliers. We don't see any dots outside our whiskers. But think about how the spread of the data sets compare. So all the ways we can talk about spread now. We can take a look at the complete range, we can take a look at the interquartile range, we can take a look at all four pieces of that box plot, setting up 25% sort of chunks of data. So why don't you pause the video, see what you can come up with, and then meet back here and we'll compare. All right, this is what I put. The carbohydrate data has a larger range compared to that of sugars, 20 for carbohydrates and 15 for sugar. So notice the carbohydrates is going from about 5 to 25, which is that range of 20, and the sugars going from 0 to 15, which is the range of 15. So carbohydrates, bigger range. However, the carbohydrate data has a smaller interquartile range. So notice how much smaller the box is here for the carbohydrates than the sugars. So that's taking most of this data and concentrating it closer to the center. Well, it's taking half the data. It's taking the middle 50% of data and concentrating it very much in the center, and then that leaves the data more spread out on either side. So with longer whiskers and a shorter box, the distribution of carbohydrates will be fairly bell-shaped, while the sugar data is more evenly distributed. So if you look at each of the four pieces, whisker, left side of the box, right side of the box, right whisker, they all look to be about the same size. So that's going to tend toward a uniform distribution of our data. And just to see those shapes a little bit better, let's go ahead and take a look at some histograms for the carbohydrates and the sugars. Oh, you know what? When I do that, as I said earlier, histograms do not automatically come out with the same axes or in the same frame. So this is what we need to do here. I'd like to have one right on top of each other, just like it is for our box plot. So I'm going to go down the bottom, multiple graphs. I would like there to be 2 rows per page. 1 row for sugars, 1 row for carbohydrates, and there we go. Ooh, although I've got them turned upside down from the box plot, so that's a bummer. So here's our sugar box plot, and well, not that it's very uniformly shaped, but it's got no kind of obvious skewing one way or the other. Carbohydrates, 50% of data, concentrated here in the center, giving us the bell-shaped distribution. All right, the next question is asking how will typical data values compare for each set? Well, in a histogram, we were thinking about the typical data set as the typical value in the data set being the point at which that data histogram balances. In a box plot, we're really looking at in and around the median. So we can see from here that the typical value for carbohydrates will be significantly higher than the typical value for sugars. Typical value for sugars is maybe down in the 7 range, but up at almost 15 for the carbohydrates. All right, I've got my answer put in there, and this is the end of Mod 9. We've got one more module to cover, and then we'll be ready for that exam.